So, welcome to Meditation 101. This is the first of four classes in the course. And as I always say, the main purpose of this course is hopefully to let people leave with an understanding of the tools that they need to have in order to start or to deepen a meditation practice on their own. Um, so we will, throughout the course, will be engaging in some practices, some group practices of meditation as examples, but there will be a fair bit of information also given about the process of meditation, particularly from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective. All right. So we'll start by kind of defining what we mean by meditation from, again, from that Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So in English, the word meditation that we're using is a translation of the word gom, Gom, in Tibetan. This place, this where I am, is called a gompa. It's called a place of meditation, and in English, the word gom um, could have a different meaning or a more specific meaning, which is to become familiar or to familiarize. So when we meditate, we are familiarizing our mind. And particularly, we are trying to familiarize our mind with a virtuous object. So we can say that, throughout our day, throughout our lives, we are consistently becoming more and more familiar with any of the things that we intentionally put our attention toward. If we spend a lot of time thinking about how people have, you know, so I stopped doing that. If we spend a lot of time thinking about how people have, engaged, treated us badly, and wanting to respond to that with our own ways of, treating them badly, then we will be practicing a particular way of thinking. We'll be practicing the idea that we ought to return harm with harm. And the more that we settle the mind on that way of thinking, the deeper that tendency will become over time. And Buddhism would say that that is a kind of familiarization, and it's something that we may do in daily life, but it's not a virtuous object. So it's not a suitable object for meditation. Meditation is meant to be the main vehicle, one of the main vehicles that we use to develop our good qualities, to progress. You could say if a person chooses to take enlightenment as their goal, then for that person, meditation would be one of the main vehicles that they would use to progress toward enlightenment. If a person takes it as their goal to be kinder, wiser, more compassionate, more loving, then meditation would be the principal vehicle for accomplishing that goal. This class is not intended to give a person a particular goal, but it's meant to explain how meditation can be used to further a variety of useful spiritual goals. So, yeah. And so when we say familiarizing, there are different things that we become familiar with when we meditate. Um, there are, you could say, we become, so in Tibetan Buddhism, there's what's called analytical meditation, which might be new to some people. It is the idea that we can take a conceptual topic and in meditation follow a particular chain of reasoning or chain of logic that demonstrates some insight into that topic. And then we become more and more familiar with that particular way of seeing that topic by way of that logic, that argumentation, that chain of ideas. So, for example, we might, yes, you have a question? In English, it's called analytical meditation. So, because so the question was, what was the name of that type of meditation where and so the answer is, so for the, because they can't hear you when you, uh, so, so when we say analytical, what we mean is, so for example, we might want to become familiar with how incredibly precious our life is. Um, and that insight will help us to kind of to help us to overcome the tendency that we might have to take our life for granted. We might look at the world and say, well, there's 7 billion humans, being human, not such a big deal. Um, so, my life is very common, very ordinary. It's not significant in any way. So it's okay if I just sort of um, skate, through my life, because it's just very typical. That way of thinking is an obstacle to spiritual growth and development because we might then very easily gravitate toward all kinds of distractions, even perhaps wrong, harmful actions, um, because we just sort of think that there's nothing particularly unique or special or precious about the life that we possess. So we want to argue against that perspective by, so within that historical meditation, there are 18 specific reasons why our life is incredible, which is 18 specific reasons that demonstrate that our life is rare, is precious, is extraordinary. So ideally, a person would memorize those 18 over time, not like within a week, but within 3 months, 6 months, you would memorize those, and then you would analyze whether or not that applies to your own life. And you would go through and so this kind of meditation is really a specialized form of thinking. It's not really different. It's not mystical. It's a specialized form of thinking in the sense that I use the word specialized because normally when we're thinking, we are tolerant of distractions. We might be reading a book, and we might be kind of like, we might have decided, well, okay, I'm going to go read a book. And so we sit down, we open the book, we read the book, but then we might stop because this sentence reminded us of something, and then we kind of stop and we think about that for a while. We come back to the book. This other thing, the phone rings, we get up and we answer the phone. So that decision to read the book, it wasn't really bounded very tightly. We're kind of tolerant of all kinds of distractions. And meditation, what distinguishes an analytical meditation from just kind of pondering, is that we try not to be tolerant of distractions. Distractions arise because that's the nature of the mind, but when they arise, our job, our instruction, is to notice that the mind has moved from the intended object to something other than the intended object, and then to just bring the mind back to the intended object. So as long if we've decided that we're going to meditate on precious human rebirth, then there's 18 different qualities. And so the mind is quite active. The mind is actively going through this and this and this. So as long as we are bounded by those 18 things, then it's not a distraction. The mind is actively doing the right thing. But if we start thinking about what we want to have for dinner, or this thing that is happening at work tomorrow, then we have to bring the mind back to within the bounds of that meditation. So that's called analytical meditation. Yes. Mhm.
And it doesn't have to be, you could do analytical meditation with any concept, question, or sort of object and precious object, and that doesn't have to be the preciousness of life.
Right. So the question from the Gompa is that, can kind of anything in general serve as an analytical meditation? So I would say, um, maybe two things jump out. First, anything can be as long as it would be considered virtuous. So as long as you're intending to use that time to establish a constructive way of thinking, something geared toward greater love, greater compassion, greater generosity, ethics, something in that kind of general vein, then yes. Um, the second thing is that within Tibetan Buddhism, and again, it isn't to say that there's a right way and a wrong way to do spirituality, um, but within Tibetan Buddhism, the analytical meditations that you find most often are, part of what are called the stages of the path to enlightenment. So the people within Tibetan Buddhism, historically speaking, people are using analytical meditation to kind of replicate the insights, the specific insights that the Buddha had, that resulted in his mind transforming from ordinary mind to enlightened mind. Um, and so there's maybe 15 specific contemplations or topics, because within those 15, you can generate, a variety of individual contemplations, but 15 maybe major topics of the stages of the path. Um, and for Tibetan Buddhists, again, if that's their goal, if that's what a person has decided is their goal, then most of what they're doing is coming from that body of knowledge. Um, but of course, incredibly beneficial to, like, um, to think about, well, I got angry today, and, I don't want to, I blew up at someone, and I lost I screamed at them, I said an unkind thing. So then to do a meditation where maybe you give yourself a do-over, and you're like, what would it look like had I not done that? What would it look like if I had responded politely, or if I had, constrained myself, or said, expressed my needs in a better way? express my boundary in a better way, because then you're practicing hopefully, it's very similar to how athletes and things, they visualize the ball going in. They don't visualize screwing up. They visualize doing it the right way. And just by visualizing doing it the right way, they're actually more likely to do it the right way. So we can use meditation like that in kind of a more secular way. So it has all kinds of
Do that all the time. I didn't know it was called.
yeah. So what distinguishes analytical meditation from what's called stabilizing meditation um, is that with analytical meditation, we're using thoughts, we're using words, ideas, concepts, language. We're employing language in our minds, not necessarily out loud, although mantra, is a thing that can be part of some meditations, but we're using verbal thinking in the session of meditation. We might do stabilizing meditation, which is usually using a bodily sensation rather than a bunch of words. So, like a breathing meditation is something that everybody has heard about, and because the Buddha taught that as a vehicle for developing concentration. So, we use stabilizing meditation mainly because it is not intentionally discursive. Analytical meditation is intentionally discursive because we're starting with this point and then that point and then that point, and we're doing that on purpose. So the mind's very active. When we're just focusing on the breath, in theory, we can do that for 10 minutes or however without any without any thoughts arising in the mind, in theory. But of course, that's not our actual experience. It takes decades of intense effort to get to that point. But we're not intentionally adding discursiveness to the mind. The discursiveness, the discursiveness that's there are just the distractions. It's just sort of the natural functioning of the mind to go off on this and go off on all of these different directions. And still, our job then is to notice and bring the mind back to the breath, to notice and bring the mind back to the breath over and over again during. And then by doing that, the periods that we remain on the breath will elongate, the distractions will reduce in their frequency, their intensity, their duration. And we will find gradually over time that we stay on the breath better and better over years, over decades of consistent practice. And that is a little bit quicker in helping us to learn concentration as a skill than a discursive and intentionally discursive meditation. So, kind of a well rounded practice would involve both. Like, not maybe not every day, but over the course of a week, would involve both. Um, yeah. Lorraine, any questions so far? All right. Mhm.
Stabilization, is it always, almost always breath? Or are there other focal points?
So it's something that you can cause to arise without the use of thought. And so generally the breath is the most common. Um, you can use like scanning the body, like just the fit, like just trying to become aware of the weight of the body, the sensations that are arising in the body, hot, cold, so because most things are going to require the use of thought to generate. Um, I mean, at a certain point, um, I mean, like a visualization has, you know, aspects of single point stabilizing, but it's also active because until you're incredibly familiar with what you're visualizing, you do have to kind of actively build it in the mind.
It's not visualizing anything in particular, just the light.
Hmm.
But for some reason, I do end up there, especially if it's during the day and it's bright out. I'll end up focusing on point of light, keeping my eyes closed.
Yeah. So within Tibetan Buddhism, the way that they will couch what is or isn't meditation is that, and that's not necessarily true of all Buddhist traditions historically, in the sense that you do sometimes find techniques where a person might look at a candle, or they might, you know, have some sort of sound. But in Tibetan Buddhism, they really don't use the senses intentionally. Meditation is always a mental activity, rather than relying on. So, and there are, like, in particular, not really so much in Tibetan Buddhism, but you find in Theravada Buddhism, the Southeast Asian tradition, you might find a color, as a, but it would be the imagination of the color. It wouldn't be like an actual colored card or something. You might, and even with like visualizing enlightened beings, which is very common in Tibetan Buddhism, you in the like prior to the session of meditation, you would look at an actual representation of that enlightened being, but then you would close your eyes and you would try to just remember what you were seeing. Or you might read descriptions of, it has this many arms, that it's this color, it's holding this implement in this arm, in this hand, and and there's garments of, so you would read like a verbal description that would help you to build the visualization. But in the actual session, you would never be looking at something. It's always a mental activity that is what meditation is. From the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, that's not universally true. But in Tibetan Buddhism, they just don't rely on external objects um, in the session itself. Okay. So Lorraine, any questions? Sorry, I know I asked, but this table is going to bother me. I should meditate on that, I guess. So then, so let's talk about the meditation posture that is typical in Tibetan Buddhism. The purpose of thinking about our posture, which is taught, is called the 7-point meditation posture. Its purpose is to help us to put the body in a really stable position, such that as we progress through the stages of concentration, there's a deep relaxation response that happens in the body as we progress through deeper and deeper levels of concentration. And if our body is really stable, then we can have that happen, and like the body doesn't flop over, it doesn't, like, nothing happens, because we put the body in a really stable position, and then we can just kind of forget about it, and we can allow the body to relax further and further, um, without that becoming an obstacle to those deeper stages of meditation. And also, we prevent like the hands from falling asleep and like tingling and causing us to get distracted. If everything is just kind of stable and self-contained, we really can kind of just let the body go in the session and just focus on the mind. um, so with that, we can start by um, talking about, so again, there's 7 points that we'll talk about. The first is the legs. So the ideal position is seated on a cushion on the floor. That's generally considered to be the best. A chair is perfectly fine, um, but seated on a cushion on the floor is generally ideal. So if we assume that we are on a cushion on the floor, then with our legs, there's kind of 3 different options. Best option is to rest each foot on each opposing thigh. That's called the full Vajra position. It requires a high degree of flexibility to do. Very few people can do it for long periods of time. Um, what they would say, so that's the ideal, that's the most stable position. The second most stable position is to rest one foot on one opposing thigh and tuck the other foot in. That's the half Vajra position. So if you can do that, then do that. That's the second best option. The third best option is just a normal cross-legged position, just kind of Indian style is what they call it. Maybe that's not um, politically correct anymore, but they just just normal cross-legged position um, is the third best option. So, and they don't, in Tibetan Buddhism, they don't really have um, ways of developing, like they don't really have movement. Um, yeah, like yeah, they don't really like use yoga as a Hindu tradition, um, and Tibetan Buddhism doesn't really have anything similar. But yoga is, of course, wonderful for flexibility and mind-body connection and all of that. So what they say, the guidance that they give is, if you need to start with normal cross-legged, then do that. If you can, in the very beginning of your session, try to take one foot and just kind of try to move it up as best you can until it starts to be a little uncomfortable. Don't do anything that hurts, but when you start to feel some resistance, some uncomfortableness, then just keep it there. And then maybe only keep it there for a few seconds and then just go back to normal cross-legged. If you do that at the beginning of every single session, then in theory, maybe in a couple of years, you'll be in full Vajra position. Because you're stretching the tendons and everything, and you're kind of, so just for a couple seconds at the beginning of every session, try to move toward the full Vajra without, again, being very sure not to do anything where there is actual pain. Um, yeah. So those are the three options with the legs. Again, or a chair, of course, is fine. Um, Okay, so moving up from the legs, now we need to think about the arms and the hands. So with the arms and the hands, generally what they would say is in our tradition, right hand over left hand, with the palms upturned and then the thumbs touching up against the body. So just in a normal, just like this. If you want to rest your hands on your knees, that's fine too. What you want to avoid is having your arms just dangling by your sides. That's, because again, all of the blood will just pool and it's bad news. So one of these, where your hands and where they're supported by your legs is either like this or like this. The best way to do it. So, and then you want to, with your arms, you don't want them like intentionally like drawn in on your body, but you also don't want to be thinking about like holding them up here the whole time that you're trying to meditate. So you just want to kind of, make sure that there's a bit of space, a bit of room, but then just kind of let them just kind of, so they're not tight against the body and they're also not flayed out. But you just kind of, you want some circulation under the arms with air and so on. But just like, but a kind of a normal, relaxed arm. And so then moving up still, you want to think about the back. And the back is really the most important part of the posture. So you want to avoid being hunched. You want to avoid being, leaning right or left. You want to avoid slouching. But also, it's also really important to think about avoiding rigidity in the body or avoiding any kind of tightness. So we don't intentionally, now, it's true when a person starts to meditate, they will find that a lot of the small stabilizing muscles in the low back and so on, they can get fatigued and there might be some soreness, day after, so on, or for a while. So we are doing something that will gradually over time kind of build up those small stabilizing muscles, and that fatigue and so on will pass. But you want to make sure that you're not clenching anything or intentionally tightening down the muscles of the back. You want to have a sense of relaxing into the posture, the position, kind of thinking of the body sort of hanging on itself, um, kind of setting the back and letting the body fall into place, is the kind of the best way to think about it. Um, but we do that by making sure that the back stays upright. That so we do as this during the session we want to check in, kind of with our posture, and notice: have I started to lean? Have I started to slouch? Am I, hunched over in any way? And then to correct that gently so that the body remains upright under its own power. And that's really the most critical part of the what we do with the body. So then from there, we want to think about the head and the neck. So we don't want to be looking up at the ceiling when we're meditating, and we don't want to be looking directly like down at our knees. We want to have just a slight downward tilt to the head, just a very slight couple of degrees kind of downward angle, so that we're kind of naturally focused, maybe a foot or two in front of the legs on the ground would be the natural kind of field of view that we would have. Um, Yeah, so the chin is just ever so slightly kind of tucked so that we have a slightly downward gaze. And then the eyes is another point of the posture. So here, generally, what they would say is that it's best if our eyes are slightly open. Um, People ultimately can do what feels most comfortable for them. Um, but the point of having them slightly open is so that we remain alert. It's going to increase the amount of light coming into the eyes. It's going to give us some kind of visual, not, I mean, not that we're meant to focus on, but it gives a little bit of stimulation, visually. Um, and so it helps the mind to not move into drowsiness, to not move into a state of sleepiness. So, if we do really feel much more comfortable with our eyes gently closed, then we just want to think about, do I have enough ambient light in the room? I do think that what we would want to avoid is closing our eyes and then going into a dark room. Um, that is going to make it very easy to tend toward drowsiness. And that's the opposite of what we're trying to do. We're trying to have the body be very relaxed, but the mind be very sharp, very alert, very, you know, intensely focused on the object of meditation. So that's another perhaps misunderstanding that can arise, is that meditation is just not thinking. It's just not having an object. There is always an object from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective. It's distraction that you want to reduce. But even if the object is the breath, then the breath is the object. And anything that isn't the physical sensation of the breath is a distraction. So you never would meditate without deciding on what the object was meant to be prior to that session of meditation. Um, and then once you've settled on that, you keep it for that whole session, and anything that falls outside of it is a distraction. And your only job is to notice that the mind is no longer on the intended object, and then to just pull the mind back.
So the stabilization meditation would the object be the breath?
It could be, yeah, or or a different bodily sensation,
Okay.
but yeah,
And then in other types, maybe mantras or meditation.
yeah. So if it's a meditation on, you know, love, then you might, it could be, then when you're thinking about wishing all sentient beings to be happy, you know, you might be bringing to mind specific sentient beings and like thinking, may you be at ease, may you be. And what can happen though, like you might be using members of your family at one point, like, thinking of your parents, your sib, and thinking, may you be. And what could happen is that then you start thinking about the kindness of your parents. And now, but that's a distraction from this point of view. It's a virtuous object, but it's a different meditation. If you want to do a meditation on the kindness of your parents, fantastic, do that, but give it its own session. If you're meditating on love, you're only supposed to be thinking, may you be happy, may you be at ease, may you be free of, you know and when something else arises, you have to stop indulging in that, even if it's a virtuous object, because it's not the virtuous object that you've chosen for that session. And it's important. I mean, the whole purpose of dealing with distraction is to discipline the mind to stay focused on the intended object, because even if we allow the mind to go from one virtuous object to another virtuous object to another, it's there's no focus, there's no discipline to the mind, because it's boring. When you do the same, there's a certain repetition, to it, and you're like, oh, this is the 800th time that I've meditated on this. But if we really want to make progress, we have to avoid indulging in just our rebelling against that discipline, against, because that's normal. Like, we want stimulation, we crave kind of just, oh, can I please do anything other than this one more time? And that tendency is really an obstacle, and so we're disciplining our mind to deal with that tendency. uh, so then the last kinds of parts of the posture is, I mean, they talk about the mouth. They say that our mouth should be closed, so we're breathing in and out through the nose. We're not breathing in and out through the mouth, because breathing in and out through the mouth will dry out our throat, and that will cause a tickle. It's just not good for longer sessions. Better to breathe through the nose. But we want the mouth to be relaxed. We don't want to be clenching, but we do want the lips to be, essentially lightly touching, and then breathing in and out through the nose rather. Um, and then they say, if you can, to think about placing your tongue on the upper palate behind the teeth is good, if you can think about that. Sometimes that's just, you don't have a lot of room in your mouth, and that's just kind of like where it is. Um, but if but that will stop or reduce the production of saliva if your tongue is resting on the upper palate behind the teeth, which will help you have to swallow less often as you're meditating. It won't stop you from drooling. Has all kinds of benefits. So to think about resting the tongue on the upper palate behind the teeth can be helpful, if you find that it's kind of resting on the lower part of the mouth. Um, so those are all of the essential points for what we would do with the body to try to put it in the most stable position. Any questions? Okay, so now we'll talk about the two skills. We've kind of touched a bit on them, but the two main skills that we use in meditation, one is called concentration, and the other is called mindfulness. So, so one definition, we've said that meditation is uh, familiarizing the mind with a virtuous object. Another way of thinking about meditation is the ability to concentrate the mind on a chosen object for as long as you would want. That's another aspect of this process, that we grow in concentration as we progress in our practice. And the ultimate goal, well, there's different levels of that. But the level of that Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhists in particular, are most striving for is called single pointed concentration, um, or calm abiding. Um, so, or also called shamatha or shine, in Sanskrit, Tibetan, um, but translates in English as calm abiding, single pointed concentration. It is a particular, there's it's also called fully qualified calm abiding, because there's 9 levels of before a person reaches fully qualified calm abiding. There are 9 levels that, and we're not really going to go into those in any specific detail in this class, like the definitions of each one. It's arbitrary. It's a particular way because you could talk. There could be 18 levels with just different definitions, or 32 levels with just different definitions. Um, but the definitions are descriptions of what it's like to be able to concentrate the mind to that degree. So they describe things like how how many seconds or minutes the object appears to the mind before a distraction arises. They describe how intensely those distractions arise when they do arise. They describe how long in duration the distractions persist once they have arisen, how thoroughly the mind is taken away from the object toward the distraction. So there, it's just a way of thinking about or characterizing how concentrated our own mind is, with the goal of reaching fully qualified calm abiding, which is the ability to effortlessly cause the object to arise in the mind and then remain with that object incredibly vibrantly present in the mind without any reduction in that intensity, that vibrancy, for even days. They would say you could remain, at a certain point. You have to eat, you have to drink, at a certain point. But as I was talking about that relaxation response, the heart rate slows, the breathing slows, your digestion slows. So when you've gotten to that point, it really could be days before you need to drink something, before you need to eat something, provided that you're sheltered from the cold and so on. Um, so that is, and then it's true. It's also true that there are levels of concentration that go beyond calm abiding. Those are what are called the jhanas. So calm abiding is, but in Tibetan Buddhism, the other what are called the other absorptions, the jhanas, the form and formless absorptions, um, they they're not so emphasized. They're emphasized. You do find them emphasized in Theravada tradition. Um, you don't find them as emphasized in the Tibetan tradition. You really find single pointed concentration emphasized in the Tibetan tradition. And that's because single pointed concentration is incredibly useful for the analytical meditations, for because it's just a skill that you develop. You become someone who can single pointedly meditate on anything, on love, on compassion, on generosity, on death and impermanence, on whatever. You become capable of causing that object to arise without distraction for as long as you would like. And that's really helpful if the goal of your practice is to deeply familiarize your mind with that insight, that wisdom. That's an incredibly powerful tool to have, um, to be able to do that. The further absorptions, they have benefits, but they they can't be applied to analytical meditations. Your mind is, um, your mind becomes a mind of, or it's your mind actually transcends the what's called the desire. We're in what's called the desire realm, and that's a particular range of um, karmic experiences, a particular range of sentient beings populating that realm. There are also form realms and formless realms, and the beings in those realms are just mind, with either subtle form or essentially no form once you get to the formless realm, hence the title, formless realm. Um, and a person can uh, generate those concentrations, those form realm concentrations, formless realm concentrations. And there's benefit to that in the sense that it really does help a person, as I understand it, it helps a person to become completely disinterested with the desire realm, which is something that we struggle with. We get caught up in all of the sensory pleasures and things that are happening, you know, tastes and touch and sight and sound, and we become enamored with all of that because that's what's most easily available or accessible to our bodies, and consequently our minds. So the form and formless absorptions kind of show us that there's a state that's much more subtle, that's much more blissful, that doesn't depend upon the coarse kind of eating and drinking and touching and hearing and all of that, which does help a person reorient to integrating meditation in their, it kind of helps them to become a meditator, and like that's all they want to do then is meditate. um, but it can also just replace one distraction with another distraction, which is one reason why it's not so emphasized, because you can just get addicted in a way to enjoying the formless absorption or the form realm absorption, and it's not so productive. There's a if you can see the benefit of it and just take it and just engage in it for the benefit, and then we just kind of leave it, then great. um, but there are, throughout history, there have been meditators that just was like, oh, this is really fun, I really enjoy this formless realm absorption, and they just kind of do that all day every day, and they kind of just spend their life that way. And from the Buddhist perspective, not much benefit to that. um, they will die, and then what Buddhism would say is that when they die, they'll take rebirth in that absorption, in that realm. And that's actually the only way you can take rebirth in that realm, is to develop that concentration as a human. That's why there are beings in those realms, because they developed the form realm concentration or the formless realm concentration, and then they died, and then because their mind was so familiar with that, it their mind just went there, their mind, and then they persist in the form or formless realm, and then they die in that realm, because it's just an ordinary realm where consciousness can inhabit, and then they die again, and now they're somewhere else. So in the scheme of things, not so beneficial. I mean, there's benefit, but it's not a good in and of itself. It's not an intrinsic. You have to use it for the right reason. So it's not so much of a goal in Tibetan Buddhism, but single pointed concentration is the main goal, because it is uh, the analytical meditations of the Lam Rim, the stages of the path. Again, just from the historical Buddhist perspective, it's those contemplations, it's that wisdom that liberates a person from suffering. So having single pointed concentration that you're applying to those meditations, incredibly beneficial. Form and formless realms, not as much. Okay, any questions?
Interesting story.
Okay. No questions. All right.
I have one.
Sure.
So analytical and stabilizing is there's two predominantly, or did you say there were four?
No. No. So yeah. So and it's also true that an analytical meditation has an element of stabilizing meditation in it, or single pointed meditation in it, because, as I mentioned, it's presenting. But yeah, so there's two broad categories. Um, a stabilizing meditation is anything that a person might do where they are not having to use thought, where they're not intentionally having to use ideas. An analytical meditation will require the use of thought, will require the use of ideas. But as I mentioned, its goal is to have an insight into that topic. So um, if it's love, then from the Buddhist perspective, it's true, what Buddhism would say is that as ordinary sentient beings, we do have some familiarity with love. There are people on the earth and maybe animals, and that we naturally do want to be happy. We want our spouse or our children or our best friend, our parents. We do naturally, genuinely, spontaneously want them to be happy. And that's the Buddhist definition of love, is the wish, but it's the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to be happy and to have the karmic causes of happiness. So from the Buddhist perspective, we, as an ordinary sentient being whose mind is not yet trained, we have the sort of the seed of love in the mind already, which if we didn't, if love was a completely foreign concept, that would be very difficult. But it's not. We do have some inkling of what that is. But from the Buddhist perspective, we don't, or generally speaking, we wouldn't only meditate on the love that we already have. Like the purpose would be to expand the love that we have. Um, so the insight would be, I, I want to, and so it kind of depends because there's other classes and I don't want to, you know, I have a tendency to just like, oh, but then there's this, um, so it's within analytical meditation there are different types. With love, the purpose of that is to actually become that, to have the mind be suffused with that, to be love. Because love is the wish for oneself and all sentient beings to be happy and have the karmic causes of happiness. So we want that state of mind to become just how we operate. Just like it's not there sometimes, it's not there for some people, it's there for all sentient beings all of the time. That's the goal. So the mind is meant to be generated into love, or into compassion. Compassion is the flip side or the other side of the coin. It is the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to be free of suffering and the karmic causes of suffering. So we generate love and compassion, the wish to be free of suffering and the wish to be happy. Um, but we're meant to think about it again in relation to all sentient beings. So we so that's the particular insight that we're trying to have. And to whatever degree we succeed in that particular session of feeling an expanded sense of love or compassion, we once that happens, then we actually stop analyzing. We stop going through, because I said, you might so like there's the friend, enemy, and stranger meditation is one common meditation where you visualize a friend, an enemy, and a stranger. Enemy is a big word, but it just means someone that you find challenging, someone that you don't feel warmly toward for whatever reason. Could be just that they annoy you, or it doesn't have to be like your mortal enemy, but someone that you aren't close to, that you feel some aversion toward. Um, so you visualize these three people, and then you start with your close friend, and you recognize that you do want them to be happy. So you start to really concentrate on that subjective state of mind. What does it feel like in my mind, in my body, when I'm relating to this person that I already feel that way toward? And then, so you try to concentrate on that, and you really try to stabilize that. Then you move to looking at the stranger and thinking about that person. And as soon as your mind moves to the stranger, you feel that kind of distance. You feel that separation, like you're not so interested in their lives. They're not so important to you. They haven't done anything to really benefit you. But you go back to remembering, what did it feel like when I had love for my dear friend? What kind of words came to mind? What was the subjective sense in my body and my mind? And you just try to kind of force yourself in a way, just using a remembering consciousness. How do I kind of pretend that I feel love for this stranger? Just causing that to re-arise in the mind, and then directing it toward this stranger. Um, and the more that we think about, that this stranger has, fears and aspirations and, difficulties, just like I do and just like my friend does, and they deeply wish to be happy just like my friend does and just like I do. you know the more we argue, again, we're kind of um, arguing against the default, mistaken, problematic ways that we're naturally thinking about that person. And we're thinking, well, but wait a minute, you know, they're just like me, they're just like my friend, they are equally as deserving of love and happiness as my friend is. And so the more we get familiar with those reasons, the easier it will be for that state of mind to arise. And then it's more difficult with the enemy, the difficult person, but still we think, well, just like my best friend, they deeply wish to be happy, they deeply wish to be free of suffering. They have people that they care about, that they show love, and maybe they're not showing it to me, but they're showing it to many people. They have good qualities. Maybe I don't see their good qualities very often, but their wife does, their children do, you know. So you kind of just keep arguing against the mind that wants to categorize them based on how they've treated only me. Because if our enemy doesn't treat our fifth next door neighbor very well, we don't care. But if they don't treat us very well, we care very much. So it's irrational to think that we're only looking at them through the lens of the ego. So we kind of, again, we have to argue against that perspective. Um, and then, so, and then, you might visualize just a group of people, or, people in Ukraine, or people in, experiencing homelessness, or so whatever kind of expansive feeling you can cause to arise. Now you've done the point of that meditation. The point of that meditation was the expansive feeling of love. So now you don't need to keep introducing thought. You don't need to keep introducing reasoning or logic. You just hold the mind in that expansive feeling of love, of compassion, what have you. And you just soak the mind in that insight again and again. And then if you get distracted, then you may have to um, do some, you may have to be like, oh, why? Because you could get totally, you might just totally forget what you were even doing. And then you'd be like, oh, right, it's a meditation on love, and I did this and I did. And then you cause that feeling to arise again because you've had to reanalyze a bit. But then to whatever time is left in your session at that point, you just again hold your mind to that insight again. Um,
Okay, ask another question.
yeah.
Um, I find myself asking questions, again, looking for insight as the basis of an analytical meditation. Does the Tibetan tradition accommodate that? Like, why did I, um, not necessarily replaying something in a prescriptive way, but just being curious, why did I do that? Why did I feel that? What is the meaning of this in my life?
hmm Yeah, I mean, I would say again, just I would kind of, if your goal is to also use meditation as a tool for concentration, then you would just want to be clear about, for this session, I'm going to try to do that just with one question or one, and so it doesn't spiral into a whole litany of other things. Um, but I mean, you again, so from the Tibetan, so of course, I would say Tibetan Buddhism doesn't think that there's anything wrong with that. Um, but it is also true that like Tibetan Buddhism is a very specific thing, and its only goal is enlightenment, to be honest. I mean, you we at the center, of course, will have meditations that are kind of broader than that, more general than that. But Tibetan Buddhism is like written by monks for other monks who are all trying to get enlightened. So if it doesn't serve, and so, I mean, of course, there's value in all kinds of insight about our motivations and about but it's also true that like our time is limited, between now and the day that we die. So like they just want to have the insights that are necessary for enlightenment. um,
It's like smoking good stuff.
I
Yeah,
mean, in a way,
yeah, that
but
makes sense.
okay, so that is so we talked about concentration as one of those skills. The other skill is mindfulness. And mindfulness, it's a word that's used in Western thinking and so on, um, but it has a very specific meaning in Buddhism, where it is the ability to recollect. So it's a remembering consciousness. It is the ability to recollect what the object is. So it is concentration is the mind that stays on the object. Mindfulness is the mind that notices that the mind has moved off of the object. That's something, because it's like, oh, wait, for the last 2 minutes, I've actually been thinking about dinner and not loving kindness. And so when the mind is so constant, in a way, the analogies are that mindfulness is kind of like a spotlight in the mind. It's sort of like one of those big kind of movable spotlights where it's sort of scanning the mind and looking for the first moment that the mind shifts from the intended object, whereas concentration is more like a laser beam. It's what holds the mind to the object when the object is present in the mind. So these dual, and we're using both in every session of meditation, but sometimes the object is there and we're kind of tightening the mind down a little bit, and we're kind of concentrating, we're kind of narrowing in on just the object. And then at the same time, we're like, okay, but there's going to be like, when is the distraction coming? What does it feel like when the mind is slipping off the object? Or, of course, in the beginning, it's very coarse. It's we only notice after a couple of minutes that we didn't catch it at the first instant. We caught it a minute later, 2 minutes, and they're like, oh right, I have to go back. But the by catching it and by going back, then we get better and better at catching it earlier and earlier, and eventually it's just concentrate. Eventually the mindfulness kind of subsides because and once we get, I mean, that doesn't really happen to like the ninth level of calm abiding, when we know that like it's just the object that's there in the mind, and there's just sort of concentration. um, so but generally we're using both of these. We're using a corner of the mind to kind of watch what's happening, and then ideally as soon as the distraction arises, we become cognizant of it, and we move the mind back to the object. And then the mind and so we can't really force the process. This idea of training and concentration, that is the process. And it's really just the mind kind of gets on board with that over time. Once the mind just kind of figures out what we're trying to make it do, and it will eventually just do that. But we get there because distraction arises, and we have the instruction: I'm not indulging in distraction. I'm noticing distraction and moving the mind back. I'm noticing distraction and moving the mind back. And then eventually the mind will just stay concentrated. But there's no other vehicle for the development of concentration other than working skillfully with the arising of distraction. By working skillfully with distraction, we become good at concentration, and that requires the use of mindfulness, or also called introspective awareness, is another um, translation that you might see in different books and things. Um, the 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 ability to recollect the intended object and move the mind back, when, and also to know that the mind has shifted. Any thoughts? Feel free.
I have a question.
Yep.
Yeah, so I have ADHD, and I have a difficulty focusing on, like, right now, and in other talks when I'm listening, I also doing this like happy color, you know, paint by number thing, because if I try to just focus on what's being said, I can't. I'll be in 50,000 different directions. If I'm doing one other thing that's requires some concentration and listening, I can absorb a lot more.
Mhm.
I'm kind of wondering if there's a Buddhist approach to this. If there's a way to get me to be a little bit more centered so I can actually focus on one thing at a time. But right now, it just seems like there's not a really, not really a lot of alternatives here.
Yeah, I mean, again, other than, giving yourself like really short periods of time, like maybe 2 minutes or 1 minute, instead, because like in meditation, generally, like they would start with maybe 5 minutes. Um, but if you're just doing like an exercise, like a specific exercise, you could probably go down to even just 1 minute or 30 seconds. Um, and then it's really just the same. I mean, as far as maybe Geshe-la would have a better, well, of course, Geshe-la is always going to have a better answer because, he's Geshe-la. So our resident teacher. Um, but I don't know of anything specific other than to rely on the same mechanism that concentration arises from, which is to notice that to give yourself an intended object, and then to notice when something else is arising, and then just to move the mind back. Um, and to, if you feel like it's overwhelming to try to do that for several minutes, then to just do it for 30 seconds maybe, and just do that maybe like 10 times a day for 30 seconds. um, that's the only, Venerable Rabina would have a better answer. Geshe-la would have a better answer, but I don't have a better answer.
Well, that's actually very helpful to work with time intervals. Just something simplistic is the best way to go, really, because if you try to overcomplicate things, it just gets that much worse. So thank you.
Sure. Any other? Okay, so we're just basically at about 8:30, so we'll wrap it up. So at the beginning of our class, we established a positive motivation, and now we'll do what's called dedicating. So the idea behind dedicating is that the virtuous intention that we set became actualized by following through and listening and participating, trying to manifest that virtuous intention. And that has created positive energy in the mind, and positive energy in the mind necessarily will ripen karmically as a beneficial experience. So we want to think about that positive energy that we've created in this class, and think that when it ripens, we want it to ripen in a very beneficial, expansive way, not just as a simple, beneficial um, experience, but something really spiritual, something very broad. So we think about whatever way is authentic. We just think about sealing it, dedicating it, thinking that when it ripens, may it ripen in that beneficial way that I am intentionally contemplating. So, and just do that on our own. All right. Well, thank you all very much for attending, and we'll meet again next week.